You are righteous, O Lord, and your judgments are right. You have appointed your decrees in righteousness and in all faithfulness. My zeal consumes me because my foes forget your words. Your promise is well tried, and your servant loves it. I am small and despised, yet I do not forget your precepts. Your righteousness is an everlasting righteousness, and your law is the truth. Trouble and anguish have come upon me, but your commandments are my delight. Your decrees are righteous forever. Give me understanding that I may live. Our gospel lesson is from Luke chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. He entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd he could not, because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, He has gone to the guest of one who is a sinner. Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone or anything, I will pay back 4 times as much. Then Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and save the lost. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
So today's sermon is entitled Coming Up Short. And it's probably going to be one of my shorter sermons, no pun intended. Or maybe I did intend the pun a little bit. But this really will be one of my shorter sermons, and I hope you'll forgive me if it falls a little short of your expectations. But hey, at least if it does, you know it'll be over shortly, right? But I'm sorry I keep using that same word. It's very short-sighted of me. But all kidding aside, today I want us to think about the concept of shortness. I say my sermon will be shorter because, frankly, I was a little short on time this week. I think, as a lot of you know, in addition to being a part-time pastor, I'm also a full-time Vanderbilt divinity student. I'm a full-time dad, and I'm also working on all of my paperwork for commissioning in the United Methodist Church right now, so that one day I might be able to be just a full-time pastor. But if I'm honest, I often feel like I'm coming up a little short. Short of time, short of energy, short of sleep, and yes, even short of expectations from time to time. And what really kept me from working harder on my sermon this week was simply the fact that I was working on all of this paperwork for the United Methodist Church. And in fact, all of that paperwork is due this coming week. And so by Thursday, I will have turned in at least over 60 pages of written material answering questions about what I believe about God and my qualifications for being a minister in the church. And so come the fall, after the fall, in the spring, I will sit before a committee that has read all of those papers and answer their questions. And they will measure whether I qualify to be a pastor in the United Methodist Church. And so hopefully at that time, as they're measuring my potential for success in ministry, I won't come up short then too, especially after all this work. But you know, we are always being sized up, measured, judged, and evaluated. And whether it's in our family life or our social life, our work life, and dare we even say our church life and our faith life, it seems we are always put into the position of having to somehow prove ourselves. Now, at times we may sort of relish this opportunity to show how we measure up, or to demonstrate our accomplishments, or our skills, or our talents and our hard work. But often, the constant condition of feeling like we're under some sort of watchful, critical eye can be a little daunting. And sometimes we do come up short and it's our own doing. Maybe we've misplaced our priorities. Maybe it's led to a failure of some kind on our part. But you know, sometimes there are times that we feel as if we've just come up short through not as much so much fault of our own, but just our circumstances. And we certainly don't control everything in our lives. And sometimes a combination of life circumstances leaves us feeling as if we have been shorted. Now, it's at this point that I'm reminded of a good friend of mine from my childhood, one of my very best friends, and he and I were friends throughout elementary, middle, and high school. And for years, he was one of the shortest kids in my class, and he was most certainly the shortest among our group of friends. And for a while, that didn't seem to matter that much to him, but as we started to get a little bit older and we entered middle school, everyone else started getting a lot taller, and he stayed really short. And by our freshman year of high school, his family had done everything they could think to help him eat well and do right and grow quickly and strongly. And you know what? By freshman year, he was still as short as ever, and he had just resigned himself to the fact that he was always going to be short. However, we hit 11th grade, and all of a sudden, Mother Nature kicked in. And this friend of mine suddenly began to grow like a weed, as we say in the South. And by our senior year, he was as tall as me, and he actually got a little bit taller than me. Now, even though my friend did end up growing in the end, it shouldn't have mattered if he had stayed short. And yet, we've always seemed to associate shortness with some kind of deficiency or weakness. And as you know, as I said a minute ago, it's election season right now. And I'm reminded of how often presidential candidates' heights are subconsciously read by the voting public as indicative of their potential for success. Now, I won't make anybody raise hands, but if you remember, if you're old enough to remember the election of 1988, you might remember 5'8" Democratic candidate Michael Dukakis standing on a raised platform behind his podium so that he would appear to measure up to the height of 6'2" Republican candidate George Herbert Walker Bush. Now, height has often been a barrier to attaining the presidency, and perhaps we're getting past that a bit. In this election season, I haven't heard a lot about the height differences between the candidates this year, although unfortunately we've heard about some other physical attributes. But nevertheless, it seems that in our collective psyche, short equals less than. And this is evident in the ways that we use the words short to name and describe all sorts of deficiencies. So, I think it's no coincidence that in the Gospel of Luke here we get this story about a man that it explicitly speaks about as being short. And today we hear this familiar story of Zacchaeus, the rich tax collector who happens to be a short person. And he hears that Jesus is going to be passing through town, and he hopes to catch a glimpse of this healer and teacher that he has heard so much about. But the only problem is that anytime Jesus arrives somewhere, massive crowds gather around to see him. And this is certainly the case in Jericho on this day when Jesus comes passing through. Now, if you've ever been in a tightly packed crowd, then you can imagine what it would have felt like for Zacchaeus. People packed shoulder to shoulder, people pushing their way through, standing on tiptoes, just to see if they could catch a glimpse of Jesus. Zacchaeus, being short, really had no other recourse but to be clever and climb a tree to try to catch a glimpse. And so he found a sycamore tree, and he scampered up, climbing branch over branch, so that he could get a bird's eye view of the scene and of Jesus. And you know, this was probably just as well for Zacchaeus at that time, because everybody was so focused on Jesus, nobody was paying attention to Zacchaeus, and Zacchaeus ended up getting the view that he wanted. Unfortunately for him, though, or maybe you could say fortunately, as is always the case with Jesus, Jesus noticed. And so he turns and looks up in that tree, and he summons to Zacchaeus to come down. And suddenly we have a situation on our hands. And this is the point at which everyone starts to size everyone else up. So the first thing we notice is the way that the crowd has already sized up Zacchaeus. As they see Jesus welcome a conversation with Zacchaeus, they immediately begin to grumble about it, because they've already made their mind up about who Zacchaeus is. To them, he is most certainly someone who comes up short, and not just physically short. He's a tax collector, and the crowd has already written him off. It's possible that their disdain for him is somewhat justified. You know, tax collectors have never been the most popular people in the world, and this would have especially been the case in Zacchaeus' time, where he was probably extracting taxes for the Roman Empire that ruled over the local population. And tax collectors might really have been regarded as traitors in their community because of this. And also, tax collectors could make a good living by also skimming money off of the top of the taxes they were collecting. So in this way, it's possible that the folks in town might have found themselves coming up short financially thanks to the work of Zacchaeus. And if he was rich as a result of such practices, we can understand why these people might have grumbled when they saw him. Now, interestingly, as I was reading up on this story this week, I ran across a commentary that suggested Zacchaeus may not have been the epitome of pure greed, at least. Depending on how the story is translated, Zacchaeus may at least be partially misunderstood. Today, when we read the story, and when Stephen read it, the New Revised Standard Version that we typically read from said, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." Now notice that verb, will. Sometimes when this story is translated, like in the Revised Standard Version, which came before the New Revised Standard Version, it actually says, "Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold." So here Zacchaeus says simply, "I give half of my goods to the poor," as if he's already been doing that part of what he claims to promise. And if that's the case, then it's possible that at least this crowd has an overly negative view of Zacchaeus because of who he is, or simply for what he does for a living. And so it's possible that this Zacchaeus character was at least trying to do the right thing by his fellow persons. Still, in every version of the story, he admits that there may have been opportunity to defraud persons in his line of work. And he promises to repay fourfold anyone who he might have defrauded. Now, we might wonder if such proclamations would have been convincing to the crowd, especially if they were already suspicious of tax collectors and then of Zacchaeus too, because they've already sized this man up. They have found him to fall short of the mark. He is a true sinner, and they believe he has come up short in the past and probably assume that he will again. But you know, then the crowd really is also sizing up Jesus. Suddenly, by indicating his willingness to go and spend time at Zacchaeus' house, Jesus has fallen short of the expectations of the crowd. In their eyes, this holy teacher has suddenly lowered his standards by choosing to associate with a person such as Zacchaeus. The crowd has already decided against Zacchaeus, and now they aren't sure what to make of this Jesus character and his actions either. Surely this man who heals the sick and brings comfort to the poor has actually compromised his standards and compromised his message by associating with a man like Zacchaeus. And if we are honest with ourselves, if Zacchaeus really did defraud some of these persons, and if we were in their situation, we would be unhappy with Jesus too. We might feel that Jesus was selling us short by indulging such a man as Zacchaeus. But you know what? Jesus was also sizing people up. In fact, there's one thing we know about Jesus in Jesus' encounters, both with people in the Bible and in our own encounters with Jesus in our lives, is that Jesus reveals almost as much about us as Jesus reveals about God. And in these encounters with Christ, the revelation is often surprising, and it's often contrary to what we might expect. So, here in the story of Zacchaeus, Jesus sees the tax collector differently than the crowd. In his earnestness to see Jesus, In his determination to get close to his holy teacher, Zacchaeus has demonstrated something about his desire to turn toward God. And whether he is someone who has never been concerned with his fellow persons, or someone who has tried to do well, but has still come up short, either way, in this moment, he is seeking after God. He hopes to be in Christ's presence. He hopes to know something of God's saving grace. And in this moment, Jesus can see something that the crowd does not recognize. In God's view, the people we least suspect often have something to do with salvation. God can work in and through some of the most surprising people. And in Zacchaeus, Jesus sees a man who earnestly wants to turn to God, who wants to be forgiven if he has transgressed the ways of God. And he wants to do right by Jesus and do right by his community. Surprisingly, and perhaps even to the consternation and disappointment of the crowd, after Zacchaeus pledges to give up half of his possessions and pay back any persons that may have been defrauded, Jesus declares this: "Salvation has come to this house." Here Jesus reminds us that salvation comes in many forms, and often when one least expects it. And in this encounter with Jesus, Zacchaeus has begun to be restored to God and to his fellow persons. So not only was this surprising to the crowd, but it was probably surprising to Zacchaeus too. And we can guess that this short man already felt he had come up short in his life. That is probably why he was so anxious to see Jesus in the first place. Yet in the end, Jesus judged this man to be far more than the sum total of any of his real or perceived shortcomings. Indeed, even Zacchaeus, the rich tax collector, had something to do with salvation. Now, if Jesus' encounter with Zacchaeus revealed something about the tax collector, then it most certainly revealed something about the crowd as well. And I think the ironic part of the story is that even though the crowd believes Zacchaeus has come up short, and perhaps they think that about Jesus too, the people in the crowd find that in this moment, they themselves might have just come up a bit short. Having already judged Zacchaeus to be irredeemable, they have failed to see the possibility for the work of saving grace in the life of this little man who they dislike so much. Furthermore, because they find it hard to believe that Zacchaeus deserves Jesus' attention, they have failed to recognize the true hope found in Jesus' message, that all who turn toward God and turn toward neighbor have a chance to find salvation. Because the people in this crowd have concluded that certain people are beyond God's saving grace, they have risked missing out on the fullness of God's love for all persons, including themselves. And because they are blind to the fact that Jesus necessarily has something to do with this man Zacchaeus, they fail to understand the true depth of God's love. So in the end, the crowd's own understanding of salvation and God's love comes up short. They don't grasp the surprising nature of God's love at work in the world. And yet, the persons in the crowd can bring themselves, if they can bring themselves, to accept that salvation has come into their midst, then they will catch a glimpse of it as well. And even if they can't accept it in this instance, Jesus has already proven that there is hope for them yet, because, indeed, there is hope for everyone. And so in this story, we see that Jesus welcomes us, loves us, forgives us, teaches us, and yes, even puts us to work for God's purposes, even when we feel like we come up short. And sometimes we may experience this when we are in a position like Zacchaeus, when we have been living or acting in a certain way that runs contrary to the love of God and neighbor. And in these instances, God does not abandon us to our own shortcomings. Rather, Jesus asks to come stay at our house, at least metaphorically. Jesus wants us to draw near, to be healed, to be forgiven, to listen, to learn, and to grow in faithful service to God. And in times such as these, like Zacchaeus, salvation entails much more than just letting Jesus do something for us. Rather, it involves a faithful response that mends our relationship with God and with our neighbors and with the world around us. Now, other times we may experience salvation more like the crowd does, as those who have come up short due to our present circumstances, like the crowd of people who may have been defrauded by Zacchaeus, who were under the rule of the Roman Empire and who had very little control over their own lives. We might find ourselves longing for Jesus' healing presence in those situations. We seek affirmation that God cares for us too and values our lives as well. And in instances such as this, salvation means believing that God's love really is as deep as Jesus shows it to be. There is no one too low, too lost, too disenfranchised, too downtrodden, too betrayed, too despised, and yes, even too short to have worth in the kingdom of God. And no matter how much we think we may come up short, and no matter what others may think of our shortcomings, and no matter how much trouble we have believing in someone else's potential, God continues to surprise us daily. Salvation comes in many forms, and we must trust that God sees worth in us and in our neighbors, and yes, even in our enemies. And this is what it looks like when God's saving love comes into our midst. But we will only fully experience it if we believe that it is possible. God's salvation runs counter to the wisdom of a world that is always sizing us up and looking for our shortcomings and trying to hold them against us. Rather, Jesus Christ reveals a God of infinite possibilities, a God who says that salvation is indeed available to all. And as followers of Jesus Christ, our faith demands that we trust that God's love never comes up short. We trust that if we let God's love do its work, we will turn toward God and we will turn toward one another, and we will never sell ourselves or our neighbors short again. And when that happens, truly salvation will have come to this house. And finally, if you happen to be a short person, and I know there are a few short people in here, take heart. Because I was thinking about this week the erroneous connection between shortness and weakness or deficiency. I remembered that some of the most prominent humanitarians of the 20th century were short people. Gandhi, 5 foot 5 inches. Martin Luther King Jr., 5 foot 7 inches. Mother Teresa, a cool 5 foot even. So next time somebody reminds you that you're short, tell them you are in good company and remind them that good things come from those who come up short.